5 years ago, we featured a watch, the Richard Mille RM11, and I asked, why does this watch cost $100,000? Today, that same watch changes hands for over 3 times as much, further cementing the idea that I should have bought watches instead of a house. The question is, why does it cost so much? With thanks to our friends at Tempest Watches for the loan of the watch. For watches of all prices, whether you want to buy, sell or trade, help support the channel by visiting watchfinder.com. Let's do a little bit of recapping for those of you who partied a little too hard these last 5 years. So Richard Mille is a relatively young brand, virtually a baby by Swiss watch standards, founded in 1999 by Mr. Mille himself, who was head of watchmaking at Massa, and his friend and watchmaking business owner, Dominique Guenat. They also brought in the talents of Yves Mathis, an expert across production, sales, finance, everything. With the backing of Renaud Papi, Audemars Piguet's high complication development arm, Richard Mille, the brand, forged the beginning of a new era. Not just in statement pieces, for which it completely rewrote the game, taking the 1972 Audemars Piguet Royal Oaks approach to conspicuous wealth and amplifying it to a new level, but in business as well. Most watch manufacturers start with a watchmaker and a watch, which goes out to find its customer. Richard Mille started with a customer first and created a watch that would appeal to them. The first Richard Mille, the RM001 Tourbillon, cost $250,000, back then an unheard of amount for any watch. Sure, it had a tourbillon, but it was otherwise very simple. The primary selling point of the watch was its look. The large tonneau case, curved to the wrist, packed with otherworldly looking watchmaking that expanded into all dimensions, was immediately recognizable. And so anybody wearing it could be sure that there was no doubting they were wearing a $250,000 watch. The watch was an immediate success, and so more followed. This, the chronograph RM11, came in 2007, but once again it wasn't simply about making a watch, but defining a customer. Formula One fans, to be precise, as the watch was developed with Ferrari driver Felipe Massa, starting a new line of motorsport brand ambassadors for the Swiss watchmaker. If you're an F1 fan, not only will you have noticed that Richard Mille seems to sponsor McLaren, Ferrari and Haas, it also has watches on the wrists of drivers like Fernando Alonso, even though the team he drives for, Aston Martin, is sponsored by Gerard Perregaux. That's the angle Richard Mille took, securing the right ambassadors no matter the cost. But the RM11 is more than just a chronograph. The big date display is accompanied by a smaller month display in the bottom right, making it an annual calendar that can skip the date ahead on all short months except February. As if this wasn't already a tough bit of watchmaking to pull off. Patek Philippe famously required more parts in its annual calendar than its perpetual. To do so in a watch that could survive Massa's 2009 Hungarian Grand Prix crash is remarkable. That's not the only Richard Mille to survive a high-speed accident. Fernando Alonso's 2016 pirouette into the barriers at the Australian Grand Prix, and Romain Grosjean's 67G fireball explosion in Bahrain 2020 both failed to claim Richard Mille watches worn at the time. In fact, Grosjean, who was unable to reply to Richard Mille marketing director Timothy Malachard's sympathy text message because his burnt hands were in bandages, instead sent a voice note alongside an image of the charred watch saying, "I'm a bit burnt, but look how the watch survived 27 seconds in the flames." The RM11's features continue. It's not just a chronograph, but a flyback chronograph that resets and restarts all in one push, ideal for timing repeating instances like laps on a circuit. I don't imagine anyone will actually use it for that, but then basically no one's using their Lamborghini on the race circuit either. It's also got, in addition to running seconds at 3 and chronograph hours and minutes at 6, a 60-minute countdown timer at 9 as well. Over the last few years, the watch market's seen some incredible volatility. Once as stable as houses, an increased awareness of investment value in watches has seen it shift from a gentle climber to a veritable roller coaster. Big-name watches like the Patek Philippe Nautilus and aforementioned Audemars Piguet Royal Oak have reached heights once thought impossible, only to come right back down again, at least some of the way. Where does Richard Mille factor into all of this? Well, you don't tend to hear too much talk of the brand in investment conversations, even though it's been accumulating value as well as any. The cheapest Richard Mille on the market right now, the rectangular RM16, trades at around $70,000, 10 higher than its RRP. And that's the one nobody wants. The first Richard Mille looking Richard Mille at the cheaper end of the scale is the RM5, and that's already a $100,000 watch. Go to the higher end and there's watches like the RM88 Smiley, which have more than doubled their price at $3 million. So what's the secret to this monstrous success? Not just the carefully orchestrated visual appeal, product placement and exclusively high pricing, but also availability. Richard Mille makes 5,000 watches per year, which doesn't sound like much, but is about the same as a watchmaker like A. Lange & Söhne, whose watches are, for the most part, available. With a business focus on desirability, Richard Mille has been able to identify the sweet spot in production versus demand. It has boutiques the world over, but they display no stock. Sales staff sit there all day with nothing to sell. The stage is set, and the appeal of a Richard Mille gets even stronger. Let's answer the big question, the one I asked 5 years ago when the RM11 was available for only $100,000. Is it now worth $325,000? If you're talking about quality, complexity, materials and craftsmanship, no, nowhere near. It wasn't really worth the $100,000 either. But that's not how this works. We're used to the idea of historic pieces trading for millions, their rarity and provenance driving up demand and therefore cost. They're purchased on the assumption that such desirability can only go one way. A Richard Mille is not a historic piece, but that's the masterstroke that Richard Mille and his team have managed here by creating a brand that sells because it is expensive. And it only becomes more desirable the more expensive it gets. As such, Richard Mille have sidestepped most of the conversation around fluctuating markets because it kind of sits in a bubble by itself. The RM11 is, to rope in a tired phrase, worth as much as someone is willing to pay for it, and people are willing to pay a lot for it. With prices climbing anywhere between 20 and 50% year over year for the last 5 years, for someone with the money to spend, it's a hard proposition to resist. What's your take on the RM11 and Richard Mille as a whole? Let me know down in the comments. And thanks again to our friends at Tempest Watches for the loan of the watch. And if you're looking to buy, sell or trade a watch, I'll see you over at watchfinder.com.